Around 10 years ago, Netflix was just starting to come out with its first bit of original programming. Having launched its online services, Netflix was paving the way for a new type of TV viewing and wanted every opportunity to show off what they had and what made them unique. But the brand that they had hoped to establish by saving old TV shows and championing new censor-free content, that brand has all but been completely destroyed. What was once the streaming service is now being beaten and pushed out by huge tech companies and entertainment conglomerates with more money and more licensing agreements than Netflix could ever afford. It's Disney, Warner Bros., and Apple versus the company that was originally created to send you DVDs through the mail. Netflix was never supposed to get this big, but it did. The signs were all there that this was going to be the streaming marketplace of the future, and now the future is here. Despite being warned of that for what feels like years, though, Netflix has been left completely blindsided. And now, in their attempts to keep up in a race that they had over a decade head start in, Netflix is going and making some pretty unpopular decisions. Stuff like canceling every TV show they have, raising subscription prices while also starting an ad tier, barring users from sharing passwords with each other to force a market growth, and continuing to spend $30 million on a single episode of Stranger Things. As one might expect, these decisions have not gone over very well. Today, things at Netflix are looking pretty bleak. Executives are being fired, one of the founders recently stepped down, and just last year, Netflix Animation saw a huge number of losses, either from layoffs or animators quitting to find better work at other studios. One of these individuals just so happened to be Mike Moon, who for years worked as head of adult animation at Netflix Animation. Mike was instrumental to the success of a lot of early Netflix shows, stuff like BoJack Horseman and F is for Family. During his tenure there, he was a champion of adult animated programming, and he kept a lot of shows afloat that might not have made the cut without him. Naturally, following his departure in September last year, the question was raised about what would happen to these shows that Mike was such a big part of. Netflix Animation decided to answer this by firing an additional 30 employees with him. After hearing that, it's hard not to feel like a show like Inside Job never even had a chance to begin with in the first place. That show was spearheaded by a team created by Mike, and apparently he was one of its biggest supporters. But with him gone, no longer defending the show, the future of Inside Job was left to the whims of Netflix's algorithm. An algorithm that goes through a bunch of superficial data, usually gathered within a very short release window, and from that data determines whether a show is cost-effective enough to continue to exist, or not. This is just what Netflix is now. Your show is either immediately an overnight sensation like Stranger Things or Wednesday, or your dreams are destroyed forever, and even if we say you're getting renewed for a second season, we'll just take that away whenever we want. Inside Job didn't fit into whatever formula it needed to fit in with. It lost the few voices in Netflix that were championing it, and so it was canceled. This is what Netflix is now. But anyway, all that aside, Gravity Falls 2 is a show about the deep state. In this world, every single conspiracy theory is real except for the flat earth because that one's just too stupid. We follow the emotionally stunted mad scientist / inventor to the shadow world, Reagan Ridley, and her manager role at Cognito Inc., one of the 6 secret societies that covertly run the world. Reagan hopes to one day run the company, but to do so has to combat the legacy of her clingy deadbeat dad, Rand Ridley, who just so happens to be one of Cognito's founders. All in all, a pretty standard office sitcom premise, just with the added twist that the office in question facilitates death, destruction, and the tyrannical domination of the entire world on behalf of a group of shadowy elites. Now, contrary to popular belief, Inside Job was not created by Alex Hirsch, but was instead created by Shion Takeuchi, an animator with a lot of different credits on a lot of different Netflix shows. She's also done some work for Adventure Time, regular show, and yes, Gravity Falls. It's a real shame this case of mistaken identity happened to her, especially because the show ended up getting canceled. Alex was just a producer and a voice actor. He wasn't a key creative. At the same time, it isn't that difficult to see why people made this connection and started to see Inside Job as adult Gravity Falls the same way people saw Close Enough as adult regular show. Gravity Falls always walked in similar footsteps of cryptids and conspiracies, but in that show everything was told from the perspective of a kid on summer break, just piecing together these mysteries as the clues came along. Inside Job decides to open this up a little by unleashing those mysteries on the entire globe instead of just one small town in Oregon. Likewise, the humor feels like an escalation on the type of jokes Gravity Falls would make, just now with less restraint because the Disney shadow board isn't hovering over their shoulders. And finally, there's the comparative framing of two characters with polar opposite personalities that nonetheless develop a close friendship that slowly becomes the centerpiece of the narrative in a move that feels not so dissimilar from Dipper and Mabel's relationship. From a cursory glance, this all feels like a pretty natural evolution, at least in terms of humor and subject matter, of what Gravity Falls was trying to do. But I'd say that's where the comparisons end, because outside of those superficial characteristics, Inside Job pretty confidently sets itself apart from any comparisons to its predecessor. Right out of the gate, Inside Job has no qualms about the world it's depicting. Every awful, covered-up crime against humanity is real, and these are the people who help facilitate it, and many more, every single day. And it's really this open and clear cynicism without any sense of shame or even any real sense of bitterness about the shitty state of the world that drives so much of Inside Job's tone. This can be seen from the very first moments of the pilot. Within a minute, we are just thrown into the world of the deep state with no real explanation other than, hey, this all exists, the government's fake, that's just how it is. The lore and world building of Inside Job is pretty open and apparent from the get-go, which is kinda nice for a show that's all about secret societies. The general attitude seems to be, yep, the Queen's a lizard, the moon landing was fake, the Earth is hollow and full of monsters, nothing is real, and every single person with any amount of power or fame is a complete, morally bankrupt monster. But what are you going to do about it, huh? You got your own job to worry about. That's just the realities of living under late-stage capitalism. All the fantasy and mystery of the world is funneled into the efficient inner workings of an owned and operated corporation that you too can work at from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. It'll make you miserable, and you'll be having a constant moral crisis the entire time, but hey, at least you're one of the people at the top, one of the people who are really in charge of the world. Except, not even really, because there's 5 other secret organizations who are doing the exact same thing as you, all at the behest of yet another secret organization who you also work for. Because there's no great catharsis in learning the truth or getting this close to power. At the end of the day,
shadow government is just as dumb as the regular government.
It's just assholes all the way down.
So instead of mysteries, the show focuses on something a little bit more personal. Feelings. The emotional state of each of the main characters becomes something of a through line for the first season. We turn a blind eye to the horrors of Cognito Inc. and really get into the emotional angst of Brett and Reagan. In doing so, this show aligns itself not with Gravity Falls, but more of a Rick and Morty clone, but if it was about Beth and Morty instead, I guess. There's even one episode in part 2 that has almost the exact same plot as an episode of Rick and Morty's first season. And it's episodes like that which feel like the show is moving away from the whole all conspiracy theories are true premise, and instead falling back on more traditional sci-fi invention of the week type stories. Reagan has a problem, and then she invents something to solve it, and then it all blows up into her face shouldn't be the premise of so many episodes. And that's not the only bad habit it picked up from Rick and Morty. Inside Job can also rely a little bit too much on pop culture references instead of something that would actually fit the series' tone. For example, the loose connection of James Bond technically being a spy doesn't really feel like enough to justify a whole episode spent on a Bond knockoff. It feels like an excuse for some easy James Bond jokes that Archer already made years ago, not something that feels inherent or unique to the world of Cognito Inc. The show is at its best when it's tying together conspiracy theories with each other or subverting some wildly held belief about secret societies. Episodes like that really show off what's unique about the series. I loved the Flat Earth episode where a bunch of conspiracy theorists confront members of the deep state, but none of the theories that they believe are the ones that are actually true. I also loved the episode where the moon landing turns out to be real, but the people who went there defected from America, and so the deep state had to fake it anyway. A conspiracy within a conspiracy. Genius. Hilarious. Those feel unique. Those feel like the show taking advantage of its own premise. It needed more stuff like that, and less stuff like Reagan building a sex robot or other episode ideas they took from Futurama. I kept being reminded of other TV shows while I was watching Inside Job, and it wasn't a good look. But by the end of the 18-episode first season, I can say that feeling was all but gone. Inside Job had come into its own, and I was really excited about what was going to happen next. However, if I had just watched the first 10 episodes that originally aired together in Part 1, I don't know that I would have felt that way. And this isn't as big a knock at Inside Job as I hope it comes across as. Part 1 was fine, but Part 2 was a definite improvement. This is the case with a lot of great shows. Think about it, almost every great TV show has always had a pretty bad first season, at least in comparison to what comes later. Usually, as the series goes on, the writers will pay attention and learn from what's working and what isn't. What does the audience like? What do they hate? But they need the audience reaction to get this. Until it's all on screen and people are talking about it, no one really knows how a new show is going to come across. As it airs, audiences and critics make the rounds, providing commentary and critiques, until slowly everyone comes up with a general idea of what the show is. This weird relationship emerges between audience and creators where expectations are provided from either side based off the mutual understanding of what the show is about and who the characters are. An audience has to know what is in and out of character just as much as the writers do. So much of a sitcom is, when you get down to it, just the relationships between its cast of characters. If these relationships feel untrue, or worse, uninteresting, then the show's probably going to fail. And to create something true, or at least interesting, the audience has to be comfortable. They have to understand what the writers are getting at. But none of that can happen if writers aren't given the time to build up this comfort, if audiences aren't given the time to get comfortable. Without it, audiences have to rely on their initial impressions. My initial impression of Inside Job was from its first trailer, and it wasn't great.
Have you ever wondered who really runs the world? Everything you know is a lie, and the people who are really in control are...
Jesus, can we turn on the lights for once?
Now, generally, I find almost all new trailers pretty abysmal. Advertising for film and television has had such a maximalist approach for so long. Everything needs to be the most talked about thing ever, so advertisers push themselves to include every single frame of footage they can in a trailer, even if it ruins the experience they're trying to sell. That Part 1 trailer is just like that. Actively misrepresentative of the show's tone, the show's humor, and the show's premise. In that trailer, an edgy, wow, are they really allowed to say that vibe permeates the entire thing. And that's just not the type of show that Inside Job is trying to be. People come off at their most obnoxious and unlikable. Jokes are structured around trailer guy voice narration for maximum edginess. And all personality and charm has been scrubbed away to deliver out-of-context punchlines. Not even the setups for the jokes or the jokes themselves, just the punchlines. When I was done watching that trailer, the thing that stuck with me most was how annoying the character Brett was. Just his presence alone made me not want to watch the show because he seemed like the type of character who would only exist on a terrible show. The type of character who you'd only ever see on some crappy Family Guy ripoff that gets canceled in one season. Brett is presented as the type of overtly positive guy surrounded by a group of cynical characters who because of this comes off as annoying and is disproportionately abused by everyone else. Initially, just there to be played off as a straight white male roadblock, cluelessly standing in the way of Reagan's success, and then sticking around to be the easy punching bag for some easy jokes. He came off as a third-tier Brickleberry character, and I really wasn't looking forward to seeing how the show was going to use him. But, having finished the first season, I gotta say, Brett is absolutely my favorite character. And what I had failed to consider is the value in having someone with a personality like his working at a place like Cognito. Brett is affable, positive, handsome, and wants everyone to like him, and everyone mostly does. He is exactly the type of empty suit yes man with no real opinions of his own who packs the halls of the real government. But none of this is played to make Brett look bad. In fact, he comes across as a much better person than the rest of the cast. Because there's no agenda or duplicity within Brett. He's just a very nice guy who wears his heart on his sleeve, and in a place like Cognito, that practically makes him an alien. Inside Job could have come at Brett's naivete a lot more cynically. They could have shown it as something to be ashamed about, something that would get ridiculed, but they go in the exact opposite direction, and show that Brett is one of the only voices of morality in the entire series. Additionally, despite him appearing to have a pretty flat and basic character, the series manages to build up a lot of pathos for Brett Hand. And I think kudos should be given to his voice actor, Clark Duke, for what he's able to do with this role. Brett is such an ingratiating presence on the show, and it's in large part because of the range of emotion that Duke imbues him with, all while still remaining true to the character. He has this unflappable, upbeat attitude that never breaks, even as Brett's describing the most horrible abuse he's ever faced. As it turns out, being the youngest son of a wealthy family dynasty creates its own wellspring of trauma, and the brief forays we get into Brett's past do a lot in explaining both why he is the way that he is and what he's continuing to deal with as an adult. The few episodes we get that really get into his insecurities were some of my favorite of the entire season. They create a nice juxtaposition with Reagan as she deals with the exact same thing from her family. And getting to see both our protagonists framed in this specific way does a lot to build a connection between the two, and creates another emotional through line for the series to develop, which it does really well. The final 2 episodes give Brett a lot to do, almost as much as Reagan. And I don't know if the initial idea was always for this show to be a two-hander between Brett and Reagan, but I'm really glad that they went with it. It's a great decision and it works really well.
If you want to destroy Airbud, you'll have to go through me. Maybe a boss with a big heart is what this place needs to stop being such a fucking nightmare.
Ow! I recognize your dominance.
Of course, Brett wasn't the only one who ended up surprising me in the series. Robotus, or Alpha-Beta as they call him later, went in an entirely different direction than I thought they were going to take him. He starts off in the first episode as just the MacGuffin plot device that sets off the series, a robotic replica of the president who, after gaining access to the internet, immediately decides to kill humanity. For that, he spends most of the rest of the series trapped in a glass tube, watching friends and making threats against anyone who comes around him. He shows up here and there every couple of episodes, and it feels like he's being set up as some big bad in the finale, but it turns out that the other robot ultimately betrays them. Alpha-Beta, instead, becomes a much more compassionate and much more understanding person. By the end of the season, he's arguably a better human than the person who built him. I thought that was a pretty fun twist that the cold, dead, unfeeling robot that was such a big problem in the first episode ends up becoming one of their most helpful allies and a arguably more noble, feeling, empathetic person than the rest of them. It was a nice way to take that character. Gigi Luigi is also a lot like this. She initially appears to be the vain, dismissive head of the entertainment industry side of Cognito Inc. Her role is pretty slim as a side character, but gradually becomes bigger when in Part 2, Gigi becomes Reagan's sounding board for her relationship with Ron. This little side plot between her and Reagan gives both of them a lot more to say and do with each other. And alongside this, I think Gigi is used as a great vehicle for understanding specifics about this vastly connected conspiracy that they're all living in. We can see this in her storyline about the Illuminati and Lin-Manuel Miranda. And sure, this isn't much, but I think it's a good sign that Inside Job was taking its time to develop its side characters like this. The rest of the cast is made up by John DiMaggio's Glenn Dolphman, Bobby Lee's Dr. Andre, Brett Gelman's Mike the Mushroom, and Andy Daly as JR. Design-wise, they're all great. I really, really appreciate when you can tell exactly who an animated character is and what their personality is just from looking at them. Dolphman's a jingoistic colonel who wants to bomb every country on Earth. Dr. Andre's a shitty TV doctor who's addicted to every drug he's ever sold. And Mike, the amazing, magical talking mushroom from space, gets jerked off all day. They're all pretty funny and unique in their own way, but story-wise, aside from JR, they really don't get that much to do. He's given a bit more of a backstory compared to the others, as he's the founder of Cognito alongside Rand, but this isn't revealed until the second last episode. For most of the series, he's the smarmy asshole boss who becomes the bullied intern. And it really felt like they were going to do a lot more with him. If you think about it, the only real difference between JR and Brett is morality and a tax bracket. He seems to know a lot more about the robes than anyone else. Stuff like that could have been developed into something more, and it's a shame because each of the other characters is like this too. All of them show a lot of potential, each of them is pretty funny in their own right, and they could have been given a lot more than what they were given.
Our missions do feel suspiciously like B stories.
Instead, a lot of the meat of Inside Job's emotional conflict concerns Reagan's relationship with her father, Rand. And I think it's this storyline that ends up paying off the best. He's an overbearing, but also inattentive parent who stresses out his child while being completely oblivious to the damage he's doing. And the context of surrounding this within the deep state is a nice twist. They even got Mr. Robot himself, Christian Slater, to voice Rand. Before I saw the show, I had heard a lot of comparisons between the character of Rand and the character of Rick Sanchez. But honestly, I really don't see it. Superficially, sure. They are both shitty drunks who have fraught relationships with their only daughters, and they use their intelligence to circumnavigate emotional vulnerability or honesty within that relationship. But Inside Job has a completely different approach to terrible dads. A more informed one, I'd say. Rand isn't as ambitious or as prone to depression as Rick. Rand also isn't a complete sociopath. He's aware enough of his own actions to know that they're bad, and ultimately his goals aren't entirely self-serving. Rick is a galactic, cosmic-level shitty dad, but Rand is just a regular old deadbeat who happened to fall into running the shadow government because he was good with tools. Throughout the season, the dial goes back and forth in determining how much of a villain Rand really is. He's shown causing disasters in the past and the present, but usually they give him some reason or enough distance to avoid a direct confrontation. At the end of the first part, though, this all changes when it's revealed just how much he has truly fucked up his daughter's life. Reagan breaks it off with him, but in the end, he still gets her job. However, in part 2, we see a very different side of Rand. Despite all his posturing, we find out that he really doesn't have it out for Reagan, or anyone really. His emotional, neglectful behavior has obviously hurt Reagan in a number of different ways. We see this in part 1 of the season. But I think it's important to remember that none of this was done intentionally. Erasing Oren from Reagan's memory was because he genuinely believed that doing this would improve her chances in life, and he failed to see that any other option was possible. In his mind, Oren just isn't someone who's going to achieve greatness like he wants for Reagan, and so any attachment they have together is just going to weaken Reagan, just going to make her lesser. He says this really telling line in that episode, just when Reagan finally confronts him about what he did. Rand pretty quickly admits that he fucked up and offers to erase both of their memories. And I think that's key, that he wants to erase both. It's not that he doesn't care about what he did to Reagan, or he doesn't understand how it affected her. It's that he is just completely incapable and unwilling to deal with the emotions that are required to talk about that, to actually handle it in a real way that would matter to your daughter. That's the final point the show lands on with him, and I think it's great. Rand spends most of part 2 trying and failing to get his ex-wife Tomiko back, and it all culminates in him deciding to use this reality warping device that has the potential to destroy the entire universe, just so he can find a universe where Tomiko and Reagan like him. It's a pathetic and destructive, self-serving action that's done out of pure regret and a genuine desire to feel loved. It puts all of Rand's behavior into perspective. Some of the worst, most traumatizing things a parent can do to their child will be done with the best of intentions. It's easy to look at your parents as either heroes or villains, who either ruined your life or saved your life, but that's not often the case for most people. Where Reagan lands with her father is a lot more nuanced. She acknowledges that Rand did a lot of damage to her, but he isn't the antagonist of her life. He's just her dad. He's a screw-up, and because of those screw-ups, it means they need to set boundaries between each other, but it does not mean for a second that she doesn't love him. And amazingly, in the end, Rand is able to put aside himself and agree with his daughter. All in all, a pretty good character arc.
You said you would do anything to win her back except make an effort.
Effort is for people without robots. Hey!
Which brings us to Reagan Ridley herself, voiced by Lizzie Kaplan. Unfortunately, she falls into a similar role that Dipper also fell into on Gravity Falls. She's the protagonist who also has to be the straight man. More often than not, we'll see her portrayed as the adult in the room, constantly trying to get everyone else back on track. And because of this, we mostly see her when she has to be the balancing act for other characters. And where their B stories can fly off the rails, most of Reagan's stories remain pretty grounded. This isn't always a bad thing. The show does balance these storylines out pretty well for the most part, but it also has this really bad habit in taking Reagan away from Cognito in these storylines that feel disconnected from the rest of the cast and the core premise of the show itself. To be fair, she still has her fair share of eccentricities, and despite being the responsible one, Reagan is actually the cause of most of the show's disasters. In fact, usually she has to defer to Brett, Gigi, or her own robot for advice. And these are nice moves. It allows Reagan to be both a clear authority figure and a fuck-up who will cause the destruction of Rome because she was horny and impatient. She is socially awkward and short with her entire staff, and all of this makes it very clear from the offset why someone like Reagan needs someone like Brett. And as we find out later, why someone like Brett needs someone like Reagan. When Inside Job is getting the two of them together to deal with some deep state fuck-up, or teaming up to reconcile their daddy issues, the show is at its very best. I mentioned this briefly in Brett's section, but I cannot overemphasize how well these two build off each other. They have the rare benefit of being complete and total polar opposites that are never really at odds with each other. Instead, Reagan and Brett become best friends, and their relationship ended up being the strongest in the entire show. Shown in the cast indicated this really wouldn't go further romantically unless they found something interesting to do with it, but I don't really think anyone cares either way. Brett and Reagan play off each other so well in a way that is so consistently funny and heartwarming, I wouldn't be opposed to them going in any direction with this relationship. Friends forever, a couple, mortal enemies, who cares? It is such a good pairing, I can't imagine it not being interesting.
I don't know if we'll ever get back to our realities, but I've seen yours, and it looks good. If I succeed, I'll see you again. But if not, good luck, Brett.
But...
Their relationship is just one of the many mentioned plot lines that's built up throughout the season, like JR's Riches to Rags story, or the surrounding mysteries of the Shadowboard. Another comes in the repeated questioning about the ethics and morality about working at a place like Cognito Inc. And I think this is the one story beat that Inside Job doesn't quite manage to nail. One of Brett's first lines in the first episode is, "Question, is this place evil?" And the answer seems to be a very obvious and resounding, yes, of course it is. But that is not always the angle the show necessarily takes. Reagan responds to Brett's question by equating working at Cognito with working at any other evil corporation, except with the very important difference that what she does at Cognito actually matters. It actually affects the world in some way. But this isn't a very good reason for working at a place like Cognito. This isn't a good reason for doing stuff like trapping a town in the 1980s or creating a real hell for the Vatican. Cognito Inc. is just so blatantly evil, and everyone seems to agree with it and understand that, except for Reagan and Brett. Now you can give Brett a pass because he's just some big dumb himbo, but it's weird that Reagan has gotten this far into running the deep state and still seems to think that she's a good person or that there's an ethical way to do this job. The show frequently turns to moments of Reagan questioning the things she's done at work and the ultimate value of them, but it never really fully lands on how exactly she feels about it. And I get the obvious metaphor they're going for here. Reagan is sacrificing herself to a faceless corporation that doesn't care about her. Gee, I wonder what inspired that. But this does sort of make Reagan look like either extremely naive or a massive hypocrite. Things do improve, admittedly, as we get towards part 2 and the character of Ron, played by Adam Scott, is introduced. In the first part, Reagan didn't really have anyone to confide in about these moral questions or anyone to challenge her about what she was turning a blind eye to. She was the boss. Everyone deferred to her. But Ron is the first one to rightly call her out as the whiny, overprivileged Nepo baby who's upset that she has to wait a little bit before it's her turn to have the most powerful job on Earth. He also mirrors a lot of Reagan's own personal issues with the deep state in his plotline of erasing people's memory. Ron and Reagan begin a relationship, and Reagan's motivations and trepidations surrounding her future at Cognito become a lot clearer. It's an awful, corrupt system that only serves the rich and powerful, but maybe if she sacrifices more and more and more of herself to it, Reagan will get the chance to change things from the inside. The more she suffers, the more it's all going to be worth it in the end. Again, a pretty obvious metaphor, but this one feels a lot more honest than what they tried to do in Part 1. This conflict paves the way for much of Part 2's storylines, and leads to the excellent final episode where all the themes finally come to a head. Reagan's stories walked in two worlds, the worlds of clones, coups, and stress, and the other world, the boring, mundane, real world where she has the potential to not be a workaholic control freak, where she can just be a regular person, hopelessly manipulated by the deep state. At some point, these two opposing worlds and these two conflicting desires that she had were not going to be able to coexist. Her father already invaded her work, and now in the final, Ron is forcing Reagan to make a choice. We first see how she deals with her relationship with both her parents, and, in the end, makes a lot of strides, at least with her father. But her relationship with Ron is a lot harder to detach from. There's no option where she can be with him and also rule the world, so she chooses the world and erases his memory, just like her dad did to her. And to add salt into the wound, it turns out not to be worth it at all. The shadow board is playing her. Her algorithm will be used for nothing. That's what you get when you choose to believe in the promises of a faceless, evil organization. Which leaves us with a great setup for a second season that's never going to come. Reagan is at the top of the world and ready to get screwed over by upper management once again. There's some interesting setups, like Brett taking a more assertive role at Cognito, or Reagan and her attempts to build an algorithm to run the world. I can see these going in a number of different directions. And there's also still the potential of untapped conspiracies they have yet to draw from for future episodes. You just know that they had a Jeffrey Epstein episode planned out. But now we're never going to get to see it. We're never going to get to see Brett and Grassy Knoll trying to sneak into the Metropolitan Correctional Center. We're never going to get to see Dr. Andre create COVID-19 and also the vaccines for COVID-19. We're never going to find out how the Juggalos run global finance. Inside Job is now one of many animated TV shows cut down in its prime. What they created was so rife for experimenting, but it's all being taken away so Netflix can make 7 more seasons of Big Mouth and Big Mouth 2. And look, I know I criticized a lot about this show, but I really want to stress that I just wanted to make a thorough, honest assessment of how this one and only season of Inside Job played out, now that it's about to be forgotten forever. I did really enjoy what Shion and her team created, and it sucks that it was cut down right when it was getting going. One of the first adult animated shows in a while that felt like it actually had potential. A little while ago, I stumbled on an AMA Shion Takeuchi did for Inside Job when Part 1 aired, and it was both inspiring and depressing to read through. All these old posts that she made, talking about her ideas for the show, how the process was going, how happy she was with the voice actors and her animation team. She seemed to have a lot to say about what informed the decisions made for the series, and seemed really excited to get to work on part 2. It was clear Shion was thrilled for this opportunity, and here I was, reading those words with the knowledge that all of this had already been taken away from her. However, even if Inside Job is gone, Shion Takeuchi and her team aren't going anywhere. If anything, all this show did is prove their talent and skill, and that can't be taken away by Netflix, like a second season. So if Inside Job really is truly gone and dead, don't be sad. The people who made it aren't going anywhere. These people have a clear drive to create, and I'm sure a lot of ideas left to tell. They don't need Netflix's permission to make something new. Inside Job didn't succeed in getting a second season, but Inside Job succeeded in making me a fan of Shion's work, and I'm going to be keeping my ear to the ground for whatever her or anyone else who worked on Inside Job ends up creating. If you like the show, I would encourage you to do the same. Thanks for watching this video. I hope you watch the next one too. Goodbye.